Good morning, everyone. On behalf of everybody at Arndt Fox and the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, I'd like to welcome you to Trade Promotion Authority. Do we need a new approach? My name is Michelle Wine, and I'm the Trade Policy Analyst for the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. ITIF is a nonpartisan research institute dedicated to the promotion of public policies that advance technological innovation and productivity in the United States and around the world. Without any further ado, I'd like to kick it off and hand it over to Phil English, the former congressman and senior government relations advisor at Arndt Fox, to get us started. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Welcome to Arndt Fox. It is a privilege to have all of you here, and it's a privilege to be partnering today with ITIF on an issue that could not be more timely. First of all, I want to acknowledge our Arndt Fox team who is here. And particularly, I've noticed Senator Robert Bennett was here and Senator Byron Dorgan was here. They are in the back, but they're very much in the front of our efforts here on a whole range of issues. I also, if they would wave, want to acknowledge the other members of the Arndt Fox team who are present, many of whom are working on the trade front. This is a timely topic because we are on the eve of a defining election, and yet we are experiencing slow economic growth. And there's a limited range of things that the federal government can do right now to jumpstart things. In the wake of the 2010 election, there had been a fear that there would be a lack of progress. One area where there was immediate action, and for some unexpectedly, was on the trade front. 3 outstanding free trade agreements were quickly passed, and right now we have in the queue several additional trade agreements that are particularly significant, in some respects revolutionary, and offer the potential for deep integration. They include the TPP, a Transpacific Partnership, which has the potential to set the rules for a major part of the global economy in a key region. TTIP, a free trade agreement with the EU, which will stress, if it happens, regulatory conformance as going far beyond traditional agreements that focus merely on tariffs. A TISA, which has the potential to benefit 50% of the world economy and jumpstart the global framework in a way that has been badly needed since the breakdown of the current Doha round. There has unfortunately not been in place legislation to provide the traditional authority for the executive branch to negotiate on behalf of the U.S. government. This has had a number of consequences. With no TPA in place since 2007, this has created a certain amount of uncertainty about America's commitment to move forward on the trade front. TPA is essential because it empowers the executive branch to negotiate. It makes Congress a stakeholder in priority setting and requires consultation. It protects the product of negotiations from being picked apart subsequently in the legislative process, and ultimately, because of those things, it strengthens the hand of our negotiators. This authority has fresh importance because of the scope and, in some respects, the unusual nature of the new trade negotiations that are being put forward on the agenda. As all of you know, the House has legislation pending, H.R. 3830, the Bipartisan Congressional Trade Priorities Act, but that has not been scheduled for congressional action. We have here today an extraordinary panel that is going to be kicked off by one of the central players in trade policy in recent years. Congressman Jim Moran, in his 12 terms, has made a remarkable contribution to the Appropriations Committee, but many of him know him particularly as a co-founder of the New Democratic Coalition, which has provided an important bulwark for free trade. I'm going to turn this over now to my old colleague, Jim Moran, for his thoughts on where TPA needs to go and where it's likely to go in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, buddy. Good to see you, Phil. Great to see you, Phil. Although I think next time, if you would say my longtime colleague instead of my old colleague, just it's great to see you, Phil. Thank you. And it is intimidating to see Senator Dorgan and Senator Bennett in the audience here, as well as so many distinguished guests and a very distinguished panel of experts on trade. And of course, I want to give a shout out to Rob Atkinson, who heads ITIF and largely informed the pro-trade Democrats, particularly during the Clinton administration, in getting a number of trade bills through during that kind of halcyon of trade legislation. I know that we have many distinguished representatives of our foreign allies in the room as well, but I'm going to speak from the perspective of an advocate for the American economy. Because our ability to employ our workforce at jobs that will enable our families to enjoy the full benefits of a world-class economy depends upon a focused effort to outcompete and out-innovate our global competitors on a level playing field, and to sell more made in America goods and services to the billions who will be joining the global middle class. It also depends on our willingness to collaborate with those competitors whenever and however such opportunities present themselves. If we fail to complete the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership and the Transpacific Partnership, those opportunities for competition and collaboration will be substantially lessened. It's inexcusable to allow such a win-win opportunity to be lost to American workers and businesses. We need to begin by formally identifying Congress's priorities for new trade agreements through Trade Promotion Authority, because that sets the parameters for the administration to bring home the best agreement. Unfortunately, in the absence of TPA, our negotiators have been operating somewhat in the dark, or at least in a state of some confusion as to Congress's intentions and preferences. Too many members of Congress like to complain about various elements or rumored elements of these agreements. But the fact of the matter is that our negotiators are doing their job. Mike Froman is doing a terrific job. But it's high time that we in the U.S. Congress do ours, despite the political difficulties of passing trade legislation. Those who would oppose these or any new trade agreements, and many of them would oppose trade agreements just because they're trade agreements, irregardless of the content. But those who would oppose them need to accept the fact that globalization is here to stay. We can no longer be an island of self-sufficient smugness. The United States cannot sit on the sidelines and survive economically. Consider that 75% of U.S. imports are already duty-free. And consider that mobile phones will be in the hands of 5 billion people worldwide by 2017. That means that a majority of the world's population will have the tools to participate in global trade in the palms of their hands, regardless of whether we complete another trade agreement. So right now, we have the chance to set the rules of the road, which is why we must ask ourselves, will we demand that other countries trade under rules that reflect the American values of transparency, integrity, and free enterprise, or will we be bystanders as others define those rules for us? We in the United States must turn to, not away from, the global economy with a robust set of trade rules that establish high standards throughout the world. These higher standards will ensure that American families will be protected from tainted foods and faulty products and from prices that reflect exploited workers and despoiled environments. In the absence of these standards, international trade becomes a race to the bottom, with countries disregarding the value of worker rights and environmental protection. I think that is exactly what we will have in the absence of TPP and TTIP. As we meet today, the Chinese are negotiating an alternative to TPP. They call it RCEP. I think that's the correct pronunciation, RCEP. Regardless of how they pronounce it, though, the fact is that that will heighten discrimination against the United States in everything from cars to film to food, and it will cement a lower standard approach to labor and environmental protection all over the Pacific. If TPP fails and RCEP succeeds, expect American exports to be largely shut out of one of the world's fastest growing regions, with more countries looking to grow their businesses, with more companies looking to grow their businesses in other countries with lower labor and environmental standards. And of course, we would be missing an opportunity to set standards on state-owned enterprises, intellectual property protections, and the digital economy. Now, I'm not saying that legislators should blindly support TPP and TTIP. Some improvements are going to have to be made relative to previous agreements. But Congress should and must exercise its legitimate oversight authority through the Trade Promotion Authority legislation in order to ensure that the process of completing major trade agreements is transparent, equitable, and guided by the core objective of creating opportunity at home. The alternative is to descend into an inward-facing, angry partisanship that has characterized so much of our legislative activity over the last 5 years. Democratic progressives, in particular, have spent time and passion arguing for the inclusion of labor and environmental standards in trade agreements. And with TPP and TTIP, it is time to take yes for an answer. We have to accept the reality that we cannot quit the global economy, but it can surely quit us. Without active engagement on our part, our global competitors will continue to race ahead as we fall further behind. This is our chance to help small businesses all across the country, like those in my Northern Virginia district that export everything from paper to electrical equipment to management services. This is our chance to foster broad-based prosperity here at home and to raise standards around the globe. Hiding from the global economy will not achieve that. Building new value-based linkages and partnerships with the rest of the world will. Now, this lame duck session over the next 2 months should have 4 primary responsibilities. One is to pass the 12 pending appropriation bills. The second is to authorize the Defense Authorization Bill. The third is to make some notable progress on immigration reform. And the fourth is to pass Trade Promotion Authority. I don't know that this Congress is capable of carrying out its international trade responsibilities in this lame duck when it failed to do so prior to the election when we had a whole lot more time. But I do know that if the people and the organizations that are represented here and have allied to raise the consciousness of the public and the importance of at least Trade Promotion Authority, if you don't press this issue and inform the public and its elected representatives on why it's so important to the economic health and the prosperity of this nation, then we have no chance of doing what needs to be done, and we will have failed to have lifted the living standards of the American people and to have led in the global economy. So this is a terribly important issue. I appreciate the fact that ITIF and Aaron Fox have hosted this panel, and the fact that you are here. I know that I'm preaching to the audience, many of you, but this needs to get done, and sooner rather than later, and I appreciate all of you playing a part in getting it done. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Jim Moran for doing an extraordinary job of setting the table for this discussion, which we are hoping this will be a deep dive and give you an opportunity for questions or comments. Now, I notice puckishly we're one seat short, so you're welcome to sneak into the bleachers and ask tough questions, which I know you're good at. This is an extraordinary opportunity for us to hear from some of the real leaders in trade policy from a number of different administrations who represent decades of experience. Our first presenter will be Grant Aldonis, who is the principal managing director of Split Rock International. I think most people in this audience know Grant from his years at USTR, starting out as director for affairs south of the border, serving also as Chief International Trade Counsel for the Senate Finance Committee, and finally working very prominently in the last administration as Undersecretary for International Trade at the Department of Commerce. We're then going to hear from Steve Ezel, who is the Senior Analyst at ITIF with the Trade Portfolio. He is co-author with the ubiquitous Rob Atkinson of Innovation Economics, Race for Global Advantage, of which I am a proud owner of an autographed copy. Also, we will hear from Tim Keeler with his perspective, currently as a partner at Mayer Brown, but having previously served in a key position as Chief of Staff for the USTR, serving in the Treasury, and also having served in a key staff position on international trade for the Senate Finance Committee. And finally, to get the perspective of someone who has been in the guts of the launch of the current rounds of negotiation, it's a real privilege to have Miriam Sapiro here, who currently is visiting fellow at Brookings, but as Deputy U.S. Trade Representative, has led trade negotiations and enforcement with Europe, Middle East, North Africa, and the Americas, have played an instrumental role in launching TTIP, and has been very involved also in the Transpacific Partnership. Previously, she had served in the Clinton White House as Special Assistant and Counselor to the President. I'm going to turn this over to Grant. Having set the table, we're very interested to hear what this panel has to say on where TPA can go.
Thank you, Phil, very much. And thanks first to Aaron Fox and ITIF. Thank you for your leadership, Phil. I have to say that it is, as you know, and Jim knows, and certainly Senator Dorgan, Senator Bennett, politics is very different and more challenging than when I had the privilege of serving on the Hill and working on trade policy, but probably more important, ironically, because of what globalization has done to our economy, as Jim was referencing. So what I want to do is I want to start with a little bit of a longer-term vision about where I think we need to go and what the role of TPA should do to fit in that, then talk about a short-term vision of what we do currently and why, and then lastly talk about what we can do as a practical matter, which I have to say I agree entirely with Jim. My goal at this point is to give him another opportunity to vote on trade before he leaves the Congress. But let me start with the broader picture. The broader picture is that globalization has fundamentally altered how we trade. It's also fundamentally altered the way we compete. I grew up in a world where most trade was taught in terms of the economics as well as practiced in terms of vertically integrated corporations selling at arm's length across borders. What globalization did, the political changes, the economic shifts, certainly the revolution in computing, communications, transportation, logistics, and finance has done is create a much broader plane surface in the global economy over which goods, capital, services, and most importantly, ideas can flow. And so today, when we think about trade, it's no longer through the lens of exporting, but it's the lens of how you participate in the global economy and how you maintain a position in the flow, that global diffusion of technology that's going on. With lower transaction costs, what we've seen is the de-verticalization of all enterprises globally. What we've seen is the softening of firm boundaries, and more often than not for companies in the United States, they participate in the global economy through another company's supply chain and a global value chain rather than the classic case of exporting. With that framework in mind, what our challenge is to reconceive both our ideas of market access and our ideas about what we should be doing with trade policy. What that suggests to me as sort of a longer-term vision is it may be time to go back to an older technology. In 1971, there was something called the Williams Commission, which was chaired by then Vice Chair of IBM, Albert Williams. And what it really did was take the changes in the global economy at the time, rethink what we needed, not as a trade policy alone, but as an international economic strategy. And what we really have to have is a conversation in this town and nationally about what that will be. Because as we think about trade policy in this broader environment, while we're still going to have to deal with the conventional trade barriers that are on the table, the foreign unfair trade practices, we're going to have to deal with our own subsidies and the challenges we're going to face on those accounts from Brazil and everybody else, WTO. But as we think about it, we actually have to be thinking about a broader range of economic policies that actually help us participate. And therein, I think, lies the possibility of a coalition politically, because the reality is for us to be able to compete, not only for companies to stay as a part of this diffusion technology and allow us to remain at the technological frontier, you also have to have a society and an economy that is allowing workers and families to participate and benefit from that engagement. What that means is we're going to have an array of policies that are supportive of what we're trying to accomplish with the global engagement. So the ambit of what we think about when we have to build a consensus that allows us to move forward on trade is wider than it has been in the past. And it will not fit comfortably in the exclusive jurisdiction of Ways and Means and Finance. It's been going that way for a very long time. So when you ask me the question, do we need a new approach? We amply need a new approach. That's a longer term vision and is going to be able to help either TTIP, TPP, or TISA, or the benighted Doha development agenda, which, as I recall, in Cancun, when the talks collapsed, I had the great benefit of being present, I guess, both at the creation and the demise. And I turned to Bob Selleck and said, "This is dead, isn't it?" And it turned out we were right. It was dead. We just haven't buried the corpse, unfortunately. And at some point, we're going to have to find a way to do that. So what I would like to see, honestly, in the short run, is a TPA bill that, with a very finite grant of authority, since we're talking about an older technology, but then one reflects an agreement that was reached, certainly when Tim was at USTR, about some of the most politically contentious elements of the trade framework that allows us to do what really does matter. And what really matters in this context, I have to say, above all, is TPP. The reason I say that is that it does two things very powerfully. One, it links us to the most dynamic part of the global economy. The second thing it does is it can either, depending on your perspective, pose a challenge to China and its reformers, or it can invite them to participate in a rules-based system that goes further than the WTO does. And I actually think the latter step is essential. We have a lot more to gain, and certainly I know I'm how should I put this? I'm usually in a minority when I say that I'm much more afraid for China than I fear from China. I wouldn't want their problems. You know, I've been lots of times in China with people from Congress. where I want to remind everybody you have to get past west of Xi'an, where there's still 650 million people with a handheld hoe. And then you have an idea of the challenge they're going to face with all of the things they've done economic policy-wise to inhibit their ability actually to move further. But holding that aside, TPP is important because, and this is, I think, the most important thing, Phil alluded to it, Jim Moran alluded to it, there are very few things we have on the economic front right now that will actually provide any degree of economic stimulus. We're not going to do tax reform in the lame duck session. We're unlikely to do tax reform in the next 2 years, to be honest. And oh, by the way, I actually think we need to be rethinking our approach to tax reform for the same reasons we need to be rethinking our approach to TPA at the end of the day. Having said that, what's the one thing that we know we can do in the short run to provide a boost, not just to the U.S. economy, but to the global economy, which is slowing down, is to move forward on trade. So a time-limited TPA grant that reflects the May 10 agreement on some of the core issues like labor and the environment, that is directed at these specific negotiations and does one last important thing, which is make sure that Prime Minister Abe, whose own political mandate is eroding rapidly, has an opportunity to use the political power he has to reach an agreement that will work for us as well as set the standards for the region. So the final thing is just to plead to echo what Jim was saying, is that the time's now, because in the lame duck, if we really want to do something for our own economy, stimulate some economic growth, as well as to do what we can to help in terms of the global economy, the one thing Congress can do is move forward and make sure that we're providing an impetus to the rapid conclusion of the TPP. All the other negotiations certainly, but the TPP first and foremost. Thanks, Phil.
Thank you. Steve?
Well, thank you, Phil, for the kind introduction, and to Aaron Fox for hosting ITIF and the event today. ITIF believes that Trade Promotion Authority plays an important role in enabling the United States to pursue 21st century trade agreements, such as the Transpacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, that support and create U.S. jobs while helping American manufacturers and service providers increase U.S. exports and compete in a highly competitive, globalized economy. As Grant talked about, these next-generation trade agreements matter particularly because as an economy, U.S. comparative advantage increasingly lies in innovation-based industries, such as life sciences, information and communications technologies, internet and digital services, music and film, aerospace, advanced manufacturing, etc. And these innovation-based industries have several particular attributes. First, they depend upon the global protection of intellectual property. Second, they depend on global access to value chains for the production of products and services. And third, they depend on access to large global markets so that life sciences firms can recoup the $1.4 billion it takes to create a new biologic or pharmaceutical drug over a wide global marketplace. And so barriers to market access impose particular obstacles to innovation-based industries. And so these agreements matter because they're being intentionally designed to ensure that America's innovation-based enterprises can fairly compete and thrive in global markets. They do so by articulating new standards, for example, that ensure access to cross-border data flows, so important in the big data innovation revolution, that eliminate localization barriers to trade, such as local content requirements, or the forced localization of intellectual property, technology, or production as a condition of market access, and that maintains strong intellectual property protections for patents, copyrights, trade secrets, and data protection for biologic medicines. As such, ITIF believes there are three major reasons why Trade Promotion Authority is a vital component of U.S. trade policy. First, it sends a clear and unmistakable signal that Congress and the administration take seriously the need for strong American leadership in crafting strong global trade system going forward. Second, we believe that the TPA makes the trade agreements that America's negotiators ultimately conclude better. And third, TPA supports exports, jobs, and U.S. economic growth. So make no mistake, there's currently a battle being fought for the soul of the global trading system. In the wake of the Great Recession, as countries increasingly strive for growth, they've increasingly turned to a number of innovation mercantilist policies, such as IP theft, forced localization, standards and currency manipulation, a whole set of policies designed to favor domestic enterprises at the expense of foreign competitors. Viewing with envy China's rapid economic growth, dozens of other countries, from Brazil and India to Malaysia and South Africa, have enacted similar innovation mercantilist policies. And you see evidence of that, for example, in the WTO reporting that last year, the number of global technical barriers to trade reached an all-time high. This emerging Beijing consensus of innovation mercantilism, as we described in the book, has become increasingly common, and it comes at the expense of the long dominant but now exhausted Washington consensus, which believed in the unalloyed benefits of free trade, even if it was one-sided, and was afraid to have robust enforcement of trade rules for fear of igniting a global trade war. So as such, we need a new consensus, one that holds that trade and globalization remain posed to generate global prosperity, but only if all countries share a commitment to playing by a strong set of rules that foster sustainable growth. And that's what we're doing in the TPP and the TTIP, designing them as model 21st century compacts that set the bar and lay the foundation upon which a stronger set of global trade rules can be built. If we don't pass these agreements, and let's be clear, if we don't have TPA, it will be much more difficult, if not impossible, to do so, then America risks losing out on the ability to set the agenda and standards for a more robust and liberalized global trade system going forward. Second, briefly, we believe that the logic of the TPA is sound. It's an effective mechanism for Congress to discharge its constitutional authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Through TPA, Congress outlines high standard objectives and priorities for U.S. negotiators to pursue in our trade agreements, a process which helps build consensus on U.S. trade policy. The TPA also increases transparency in U.S. trade policy by establishing consultation and notification requirements for the president to follow as the executive branch negotiates trade agreements. Having given direction to USTR through TPA, TPA then expedites the process of congressional debate on trade agreements by suspending normal legislative policies and voting on trade agreements subject to time-limited debate and no amendments. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, TPA recognizes that U.S. trade partners would be reluctant to negotiate trade agreements that would be subject to unlimited congressional debate and amendment. And that's why USTR Mike Froman, writing in Foreign Affairs magazine last week, said that by ensuring that Congress will consider trade agreements as they have been negotiated by the executive branch, TPA gives U.S. trading partners the necessary confidence to put their best and final offers on the table. And that's why an Inside U.S. Trade magazine article from Friday indicated that the timing of Froman's article in Foreign Affairs magazine was likely a result of having received a signal from one or more partners in the TPP negotiations that they need to see TPA if they're going to put their best offers on the table. And finally, as I mentioned, the TPA can help drive exports and U.S. jobs. Exports and the traded sectors of America's economy support $2.3 trillion of exports a year, supporting 11.3 million American jobs. In fact, over the past 5 years, increased U.S. exports have accounted for 1/3 of U.S. economic growth and generated an additional $1.6 million. The Peterson Institute of International Economics estimates that completing a Transpacific Partnership could bolster U.S. exports by $124 billion over the next decade, supporting an additional 700,000 American jobs. It's also estimated that a TTIP agreement would increase U.S. GDP by 3% per year, or $450 billion a year, and support up to 750,000 new American jobs. So between these two trade agreements, TPP and TTIP, we can generate over 1.5 million new American jobs over the next decade, and TPA is critical for that. In conclusion, sometimes the American public does get it right. New polling released at the end of September from the Chicago Council of Global Affairs found that 68% of Americans support trade agreements that lower trade barriers and grow trade and business ties with other countries. 63% of Americans support TPP and 62% support TTIP. So ITIF hopes that policymakers take this cue from their constituents and pass enabling TPA legislation within the next 6 months, whether in the lame duck session or as one of the very first acts of the 114th Congress.
Tim Keeler.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you to ITIF and Aaron Fox for hosting this and inviting me to speak. I always hesitate to speak speak after my former boss, Grant, because I cannot claim to be as big a thinker as he is, but I'll give it a shot. I thought I would talk a little bit about recent history and TPA and our experience in the Bush administration, having the last grant of it, but also having it expire while on our watch. As a means of answering the question, do we need a new approach? My reaction is not really. I don't mean that glibly, and let me walk you through my reasoning. So the recent models of TPA have largely follow the Trade Act of 1974, a follow-on to the Williams Commission, and that really created the modus vivendi between the executive branch and legislative branch on these matters of shared jurisdiction, as Stephen started to outline. There's been various permutations over the years and different procedural steps, but at the end of the day, you can boil it down to pretty simple guidelines. Congress sets the guidelines, gives blessing to kicking off negotiations, the president negotiates, Congress then votes up or down, and the president brings it into force once he can certify that the other side has actually met its commitments under the agreement. This gives higher certainty to the trading partners that they'll have only one bite at the apple. The U.S. will only have one bite at the apple, and therefore enables them to put down the best deals. Also, as Stephen hinted, that Ambassador Froman said. This was used to implement U.S.-Israel, U.S.-Canada, NAFTA, Uruguay round, and all the, other than the Jordan FTA, I think we're up to 20 FTAs with countries, that number 20 now. So it has expired before. It expired in the 1990s. I know a lot of people in this crowd know the history, but it's important to go through, I think. There was a failed attempt to renew it at the end of the Clinton administration. The failure at that time wasn't, in retrospect, as big a deal we may have thought it was, because China permanent normal trade relations at the end of the Clinton administration became the big trade and really the big foreign policy exercise between the two branches, and that did not require trade promotion authority. It was done. It was technically amendable and debatable, and in the Senate, Grant and I were there, and we were able to actually shoot down all the amendments that were proposed in the Senate, just passed the House bill. So then you had the 2002 Trade Act, which expired in the summer of 2007. As I mentioned, many FTAs were enacted pursuant to this, including Panama, Colombia, and Korea, which were only enacted by the Congress in 2011, but they were signed before that expiration, so they qualified. Also under it, Doha died many deaths, as Grant mentioned. But interestingly, the negotiations for Doha and other negotiations continued even after the expiration. To be candid, we in the Bush administration, when TPA expired, we actually thought foreign governments would essentially walk away from the negotiations at that moment. They didn't, to really our internal complete shock. And we all kept negotiating, but which made us really believe, maybe TPA's not actually as important as we thought it was. Which, of course, what we started saying, we don't need TPA to negotiate. All we need is a good deal. In retrospect, we did believe what we were saying, but in retrospect, it made no sense. It makes no sense to me now. And this question has only recently arisen as we've gotten closer to real negotiations coming to completion about whether you need it to really close a deal. I think the answer has started to become clear. Now, at the same time, with the Colombia FTA, TPA was shown to not actually have the degree of certainty that many people thought it did. Those of us on the inside always knew at the end of the day, TPA are only the rules of each body of the House and the Senate. And the House and the Senate always have the constitutional authority to change their rules. You can't sue them if they decide to unplug the process, which is exactly what happened at the end of the Bush administration. After we lost, the Republicans lost the Congress, the Bush administration recognized we really did have to do something different. We essentially completely changed our position on labor and environment and negotiated the May 10th deal to inject these provisions, new provisions, but also fully enforceable for the first time into the 4 then still pending FTAs. And we were successful in working with the Congress to get that done and getting the Peru agreement passed, but then we ran into rocky shoals over Colombia. And we were looking at the calendar and realizing that there was only so many days left under President Bush's watch, and came to the conclusion that we were never going to get a formal green light from the Speaker of the House to actually send Colombia, which was the first time that had happened, and decided to go ahead and transmit it pursuant to the rules laid out under Trade Promotion Authority and the rules of both bodies. Now, we knew full well that the Speaker retained the authority at the end of the day to control the House floor, but she was going to have to make a choice, either have to change the rules or to allow a vote. She decided, as it was her right, to change the rules. That did reveal that TPA wasn't as actually as strong as it was. But at the end of the day, they only changed one rule. They only unplugged the clock. And Colombia FTA didn't die. As a result, obviously, President Obama made changes to the 3 pending FTAs, and it eventually got done. I don't think it would have gotten done, or I think its chances would have been less if we had not taken the risk to send it, because it showed how important this was to the United States, and I think I'm glad that President Obama decided to take it up. But that again, that whole sequence of events led, I think, a lot of people in the trade policy community to start asking questions: do you need TPA? If it's not as strong as it is, as you thought it was, you can do China PNTR without and survive with the amendment process. Maybe it's not necessary, and life can go on without it. The administration started negotiating TPP, continued to negotiate Doha, came up with other ideas such as TISA, and another theory developed. Maybe Transpacific Partnership will actually be the train that you can throw TPA onto for all these other agreements if it's a successful enough deal. But as I said at the start, my conclusion is that at the end of the day, that's just putting the cart before the horse. In order to get TPP done, the administration's got to get congressional blessing and guidance and buy-in. That will give oomph to the negotiations, not only TPP, but also TTIP, to the services agreement that I mentioned, TISA. It will, to be honest, I think even on something like TTIP, give oomph to some of the new ideas that they're trying to do in the regulatory harmonization space for Congress to send the signal to regulators that may consider themselves independent of the executive branch. This is important. You need to actually show up at the table and figure out what can be done here. So that brings us to where we are now. There was a draft compromise bill worked out between Chairman Baucus, Chairman Camp, and Ranking Member Hatch to renew TPA with some changes that reflected new issues from 2000 that have become more important since 2002, and also some new procedural issues. Senator Baucus then went to China to become the ambassador. So you've got one personnel change and possibly another before this really has to move. I will say what's unfortunate about that timing was that did reflect some movement by someone like Senator Hatch, who was never particularly happy with the Bush administration on the labor environment and some of the changes we've made in the IP space, and he signed on to that. So, by definition, that's likely to be the starting point, and any larger changes that get made to that bill are likely to take more time. I think time is of the essence. I think the administration, the day after the election, can really push to, if not getting it done in the lame duck may be very difficult, but they can push in ways that they haven't done before. To have the big four of Ways and Means and Finance down to USDR or even to the Oval Office to say the administration wants to get this done. Those are the types of signals, with public pictures. Those are the types of things that can get done. And look, if the president can hug someone who just had Ebola, he can have the big four down to say let's get TPA done. He may like it less, but it can be done. And I think the bill is likely to change as it goes through the process in ways that are unpredictable. If you have votes on amendments, assuming votes on amendments in the Senate are allowed again, you could see the bodies changing this on currency, on some regulatory harmonization provisions that are unexpected, that frankly the leadership of both parties may not like. But again, that's the risk you have to be willing to take to get the buy-in to really give oomph to the negotiations. Like I had mentioned, after 2006, when we lost the Congress, we did change our position. I actually don't know that this entails really a change of position for the administration. If you listen to what Senator McConnell and the Speaker of the House say when they get asked now, hey, if you win complete control, can you work? Does it have to be all obstruction? They do mention things like tax reform, but they mention trade. So there's clearly an opening there. And I think if the president, I think TPP is an important part, or should be an important part of the president's legacy. I think if he wants to get it done, he's got to put his political capital behind getting it done in the first half of next year in order to get through all those steps that I mentioned to put TPP into force and really put all the other agreements that he has launched in a position to make as much get down the field as much as possible. And the one thing I will say, I will agree with Grant on. TPP has been negotiated for a really long time, and a challenge when you have that many countries in negotiation is how do you get them all to close? It's not an easy question because even on something like U.S. and Korea, when you have a very large real economy on the other side, a very big country, it's not an easy thing, and add in these numbers. Just putting all the leaders in a room doesn't strike me as necessarily the recipe for getting it done. And having a shorter deadline for TPP than the rest of the granted TPA authority is about the only thing I can think of. I don't want to say it's particularly outside of the box, but at the end of the day, if Congress says you've been negotiating for 6 years, you have 3 or 6 months to get it done, that would pretty much call the question. And the question can get called, and if it wants to get, if you want to get it enacted by Congress and put into force, which is not an easy step, by this president, then you probably need to have a shorter deadline. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleague.
Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rob and ITIF and Phil and Aaron Fox. I'm delighted to be here with all of you this morning. And Jim Moran did an absolutely terrific job of kickstarting this discussion. So much has been said that I'm going to try to be brief so we have lots of time for questions. I'll say a few words about trade agreements in general and then offer some thoughts on TPA and next steps. I sense that this is a mixed audience, which is a good thing. I know there's some people that are pro-trade, pro-TPA. Some people probably not in favor of trade agreements and therefore not in favor of TPA. If there's anyone who's pro-trade but anti-TPA or anti-trade and pro-TPA, see me after because I would very much like to meet you. And there are also probably some of you that are wondering what's all the fuss about, what's going on here. Well, in terms of trade agreements, they are, let me reassure you, they are always difficult to navigate, both domestically and internationally. But there is now a narrow window of opportunity to try and get the Obama administration and Congress along with America's trading partners in Asia and Europe, on the same page. This challenge will only get harder next year when the presidential election is in full swing. It is always tempting to defer hard questions, hard decisions, hard compromises that will need to be made by all sides. I think this is especially true at a time of growing conflict and insecurity. We see in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, in the South China Sea, in West Africa. But it would be a mistake to let this opportunity pass because of what these agreements can do for the U.S. economy. It was mentioned earlier that this is essentially a debt-free stimulus. We have already seen the U.S. economy on a trajectory of recovery, and a good part of that is due to increased exports and the role that they play in creating greater economic growth and sustaining and creating more jobs here in the U.S. We've seen the unemployment rate drop now to 5.9%, which is going in the right direction. At the same time, our trading partners are not doing quite as well. Economic headwinds in Japan are quite serious. Europe is still lagging as a result of the Eurozone crisis, and now we even see indicators in Germany that are raising concerns. So these challenges, these economic challenges and these political challenges make it even more important that the United States try to cement its economic alliances. If the U.S. can succeed in doing that, there are benefits not only for our economy and for the economies of our trading partners, but also for other countries, both those countries that are aspiring to join either TPP or TTIP, to use a shorthand, or countries that don't aspire to join these agreements, but nonetheless will benefit from the spillover impact. I also think, given the state of play right now on Doha, exacerbated by the refusal of India and a number of other countries to implement the trade facilitation agreement that was reached at Bali, really doesn't bode well at the moment for multilateral liberalization. So it's even more important that we take advantage of regional initiatives like TTIP and TPP, and also other initiatives such as the TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement negotiations that are underway in Geneva, as well as try to wrap up the Information Technology Agreement. Rob and I were discussing earlier. We had actually launched a more public approach to that issue several years ago at ITF, and hopefully we'll be able to conclude that as well. Let me also say that these agreements, these trade agreements, are not going to be perfect because no agreement is. In over 20 years of negotiating some very difficult issues in agreements, I don't think I've ever seen a perfect agreement, and if I did, it wouldn't be implemented because it would mean that one of the two parties would not have felt that it was something that they could really take back and make work. So we shouldn't be under any illusion that these agreements or any other agreements on trade or other issues are going to be perfect. But we shouldn't let that become the enemy of the good. These agreements are going to be important for the U.S. economy, as I mentioned, and I think they're going to be also critical in terms of setting the rules of the road for this century. If you take a look at the issues, I think you'll see that there's something in it for everyone. By reducing tariffs to zero wherever possible, it's going to have a positive impact on our ability to increase our exports. And as I mentioned earlier, that creates and sustains more U.S. jobs. Current U.S. government estimates are that every $1 billion in increased exports leads or sustains about 6,000 American jobs. And those jobs in export-related sectors tend to pay better. If you look at labor and environment issues, these agreements will have the highest standards of any trade agreements done previously, and they will be, if the U.S. succeeds, they will be enforceable on the same basis that the commercial obligations will be. So please, don't make any mistake. This is not NAFTA. These are not even agreements that came between now and NAFTA. but this is a new standard that the Obama administration is very committed to see happen in practice. State-owned enterprises. Right now, our economy has to compete unfairly against subsidized and anti-competitive state-owned enterprises around the world. That element, addressing that concern, is going to be a central part of TPP and also the other agreements. Access to medicine while also fostering innovation and protecting intellectual property rights. Again, something for everyone. Investment, encouraging investors to go into new markets, but at the same time ensuring that regulators can continue to regulate fairly and legitimately in the public interest. And the digital economy, on which our economy depends and that of many other countries. Again, it's going to be a key factor in making sure that these agreements establish rules of the road that benefit the United States. So I hope my co-panelists and kickoff speaker and I have given you a sense of the importance of these agreements. And then the question is, well, what about TPA? It's been 7 years since Trade Promotion Authority lapsed. It's not necessary, as Tim pointed out, as a legal matter. The president can submit a trade agreement without TPA, but it is awfully important if we care about these agreements, because I do worry that they will never come to completion and they will not be as strong as they could otherwise be if Congress does not enact Trade Promotion Authority. We know this is a chance for Congress to tell the administration what it wants to see in these agreements, but that's not the key part, because let's face it, the administration and Congress has been consulting closely. There have been over 1,400 consultations just on TPP, and when you add in TTIP and TISA and other important issues, I think we're well over 2,000. But it is a chance for Congress to publicly tell the administration what it wants to see. But the most important reason to move ahead right now is that our trading partners have made it clear, not just now, but for some months, that they do not feel comfortable offering up their bottom line, and thereby enabling the United States to bring back the best agreement possible without Trade Promotion Authority. It doesn't mean the agreement could not or would not be at risk potentially of being opened up later. That could still happen, but the chance of that is slim. And what is needed now is the political signal. So I would like to see this lame duck session of Congress that starts in about 2 weeks' time be a little less lame than many expect. This should not be a theoretical discussion. House Republicans have identified a path forward, and if current projections are right, Democrats should have a real interest in working with Republicans in the lame duck session, since they may not control the Senate come January. Again, if projections are right. But this isn't going to happen unless several key pieces fall into place, and again, fall into place pretty quickly. First of all, there's, as everyone knows, an active campaign underway by those who oppose trade agreements and therefore oppose fast track. And it's just beginning. I saw a notice that there's going to be a focused week of protests starting on November 8th. I think there are already signs up, at least I've heard about, in metro stations. So those that are concerned about this agreement, and there are legitimate concerns I think are worth discussing. But again, they can be addressed, and they can be addressed in a way that ends up with many more benefits to the United States than costs. But that campaign is very active. So if people feel differently and they want to see these agreements passed, they want to see TPA happen, then I think they need to step up their game. They should be just as active and clever in terms of figuring out how to articulate the economic and the strategic and the other important reasons for moving ahead. Chris Wank, are you here still? I'm just kidding. But Chris has been very active in this regard, and I think he'll continue to be. The second element is that the effort to persuade Congress to take the initiative here and do something very difficult in a very short period of time has to be broadly focused, not just on the trade committees, but on the foreign affairs committees, on the agriculture committees, commerce committees, small business committees, because small business is another example of the benefits of these agreements in terms of making it much easier for the companies that are essentially the backbone of the U.S. economy to succeed. They represent about 95% of the U.S. economy right now, but only 1% of SMEs feel comfortable exporting. Trade agreements can change that dynamic. Third, I think the administration has got to be working closely with Senator Reid to try and persuade him to have a bill move to the floor. It's also important that the administration work hard to gain more Democratic support. I don't think that could happen publicly before the election, but after the election on November 4th, I think that support needs to materialize. The current bill is already bipartisan, so while there may be some changes, hopefully they would be minimal and they would enable it still to move ahead. This effort from the administration obviously has to come not just from Mike Froman and USTR, but also from the White House. I believe the president would like these agreements to be part of his legacy, and I think he understands that that means it's important that he roll up his sleeves after the election and sell them domestically. And then last but not least, turning to Congress, we need more brave Democrats like Jim Moran. Once we're through November 4th, there's not going to be election now for 2 years. So there's an opportunity, I think, to really focus on the issues in the U.S. economy and what makes sense, what needs to happen now. And as I mentioned, depending on what happens on November 4th, Chairman Wyden may have a real interest in trying to move this issue through because control could change in January. Chairman Camp, who is retiring from the House and therefore stepping down from the Ways and Means Committee, obviously has an interest in trying to do everything he can to work with Democrats and try to find a solution. So I think there is a clear path forward if people want to take it. I'm not predicting this is going to happen. I'm simply laying out the possibilities and also what the costs are of inaction. The price of not doing anything in November means waiting for a long time, and I worry delaying the conclusion of certainly TPP, perhaps even TTIP, until after the 2016 presidential election. Do you think that sounds alarmist? Well, map it out and see. The best case, if November is missed, then the best case, I think, for passing TPA probably means perhaps in the spring. And that would mean that there wouldn't be a final agreement on TPP, assuming the other negotiating pieces fall into place, until sometime in the fall. And I'm not sure that November 2015 is going to be an ideal time to be canvassing for trade agreements and trade votes. On a bright spot, we have seen Congress act quickly and in the U.S. economic interest. The 3 FTAs that my fellow panelists have alluded to with Colombia, Panama, and Korea were passed on a single day in 2011. I don't think anybody thought that that was possible until it actually happened. And each of them, including Colombia, was passed with very strong bipartisan support. So this can happen, but it's going to depend on the people in this room and many, many others to make the right path clear. But make no mistake, if the U.S. misses this opportunity and fails to exert leadership, whether it's in the Congress or in the administration, then others will set the rules of the road, and they will not be rules that we like. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are going to move in a moment into a question and answer session and invite maximum participation from the audience. As you think about the questions that you would like to ask, I'd like to pose a couple of issues to the panel that have been raised by their presentations. and get their take, perhaps to start to lay the groundwork for the final part of our discussion. Tim, you were, I think, making a very interesting argument about how the interruption of TPA during the last couple of years of the Clinton administration, because China was on the front burner and didn't require TPA, effectively, that was not a lost opportunity. I would sort of pose to you, I have for all of you, a little bit of a different take, in the sense that I think we've reached the point where temporarily renewing authority will lead regularly to interruptions in that authority. I know that is what is before Congress now. And in fact, Grant, you argued for a relatively short period of reauthorization. But is there eventually a case to be made for a permanent authority to be put in place, requiring Congress to come back and regularly set objectives as an alternative to our revisiting this issue every 5 years? What do each of you think on that score?
I agree with you, Phil, in the sense that the architecture is one, as Tim was alluding to, when you take it down to its irreducible minimum, you're talking about a set of procedural rules that are passed in both houses. And what's really important about TPA is not about the architecture of Section 151, the trade agreement of 1974, but the ability of Congress to come together, reflect a set of priorities that are the challenges we're facing at any given moment. That's the essence of it. And as long as that process is built in, so it allows for the changes that happen and we want to have happen, living in a democracy, elections have consequences. So the reality is you got to have that process there. And I'd be perfectly comfortable saying, as long as Congress has that opportunity to build that consensus. I think the principal challenge we're facing right now, though, Phil, and why I would say short term right now and then have that debate going forward, is I do think we need to fundamentally rethink how we are oriented toward the global economy. I think that many of the things that we talk about is discounting the structural shifts in both the global economy and how we participate in it. And we're, I always joke about the president's comment that all these agreements are 21st century trade agreements. And many of you heard me say this, I would take that more seriously if we weren't in the 21st century. But, if you said they were 22nd century agreements, I'd be much more impressed. Let me put it that way. The point being is that I think we actually do need to be thinking that far ahead about what we want as a society, what we want to promote, and how we want to move our institutions and values, frankly, and project them into the global economy. And that architecture is one that we actually need Congress to have a discussion about, because it also implies, what are we going to do about things like preschool education? The irony is, I wrote a book a couple of years ago about globalization of the American worker. And the thing that I found most surprising about all the research I did was some research by Jim Heckman that said that most of what we achieve is baked in the cake by the time we're 5, before you even hit school. So suddenly when I think about getting ready for the global economy, ironically, I'm agreeing with President Obama saying, I think we need pre-K education. And that has to be a part of a discussion of how we prepare workers and families that has to go along with how we allow companies to compete. Otherwise, I don't think we can rebuild a consensus on trade going forward.
Other reactions?
Well, I'm going to refrain from saying who needs pre-K education. It's beyond pre-K. Those over 21 who still need pre-K education. It's an interesting idea, Phil. I don't think it's workable, unfortunately. But the situation we're in is extremely unhelpful. They're really, a short lapse perhaps can happen, but to be in this prolongated period of time, and it's not just on TPA, but we've seen what happens with EXIM. It now has a short reauthorization only until June. There's going to be another battle. AGOA is expiring next summer. I'm hopeful that will not have the same fate as TPA and EXIM, but I don't have any confidence in that, because we have somehow entered a situation where, even though there's strong Republican and Democrat bipartisan support for trade, we still find ourselves unable to thread the needle. And so again, it's a long shot, but if this could be done in November, and there are many who are working hard to see that happen, I think it would instill confidence not just in U.S. leadership on these issues, but also in the ability of the administration and Congress to work when core American interests and values are at stake.
Very quickly, I think it's important that it's not permanent, just because it's important that Congress is in many ways forced and asked to get involved on a regular basis. And the price of that is you may have perhaps these gaps become longer and more regular, which is unfortunate. But to me, that's it would really upset the balance, I think, if it was in the congressional involvement was essentially entirely only on the back end.
I think to take the opposite position, ITIF would favor permanent TPA authority with the ability of Congress to update its negotiating objectives from time to time. I think politically, you're going to have the political debate about trade at various points when implementing legislation is brought forward before Congress for the TPP or the TTIP agreement. So let's have the political debates then, instead of also having to have another political debate about TPA authority itself every 2 to 5 years. Let's put that in place, and then let's debate the merits of the trade agreements that are brought forward.
Grant?
Just a comment, Phil, to pick up on Tim's point. I don't disagree with what Tim said about the lapse in the late 90s and the fact that China was sort of front and center. But you'll remember, Phil, Jim will remember that there was also a lot of work going on something called the Trade and Development Act of 2000 with the GOA built in, the CBI. And all of that was designed from the point of these members and other members to say, can we move the needle on trade in a positive direction that then would allow us to move toward TPA, because TPA had collapsed sort of definitively in 1997. And so the reality was that if we felt some comfort that process was unfolding, that we were putting that in place and sort of moving the bow into the wind on trade, I'd feel less uncomfortable with a gap, that you were seeing steady progress in the Congress on trade, and you'd have some confidence that each step they took was a confidence-building measure to move to the harder issue, which is going to be TPA and the trade agreements at the end of the day. And those agreements, as I recall, had a way of building a consensus that actually proved helpful later on in terms of actually securing TPA authority. So what I'm mindful of is this process is one where we're now trying to interject TPA, which is always difficult, on its own, as opposed to having the groundwork laid. And the question is whether we can use TPA this time as laying the groundwork, I think, for then what would be a broader discussion going forward.
If anyone, and I imagine there will be quite a few takers, would like to pose a question, please raise your hands, and we have roving microphones in the back of the room. Thank you again to Jim Moran for making such an extraordinary intervention to launch this discussion. Also, I will follow up. Feel free to raise your hands, and I will recognize you momentarily. But a follow-up question. Ambassador, you had mentioned that there are some legitimate concerns that would benefit from a debate and discussion. And one of the issues that has been raised consistently from a variety of standpoints, and particularly by general opponents of this process, is the issue of transparency. I think everyone in this room recognizes that negotiations can't be conducted on reality TV, but I wonder if TPA would benefit from any augmentation on transparency, and where that issue is likely ultimately to be settled, if that's possible. Anyone?
The current TPA bill does have provisions on transparency. I think many in Congress share the administration's objective of trying to make this process as transparent as possible without undermining the ability of negotiators from our partner countries to explore new ideas and to try to show some flexibility. if we did have a reality show, I mean, be fun to watch, but a time elapsed version, I think. But it then can box in negotiators into very rigid positions and take away the ability to really try and put yourself in the other side's shoes, just to think about whether there's a new approach or a more creative way of trying to get to the same objective.
Ironically, Phil, it always reminds me of working on a Hill, because transparency in this context is a non-negotiable demand, right? It's one of those things you can never satisfy the claim that there's enough transparency. And so I think what you have to do is you have to do what Miriam has outlined, is explain very clearly the institutional mechanisms that are built in. But you can't take too seriously the claim that there's not enough transparency, because it's designed actually to say it can never be enough. We can continue to move the goalposts. So politically, you got to understand it for what it is. I know you know that, but politically, we got to understand it for what it is and do our best to make the defense and make the appeal on the other basis to the rest of the American public.
Questions from the audience. Who would like to pose one? Got one here, and who else? Good. We have a microphone coming, and then who will be the next question? One there.
Thanks everybody for such a great discussion. I'm Joanne Thornton. I'm with Policy Connections International. And the president and others in his administration have indicated that they would really like to have major progress on TPP when the president is in Asia for all these major summits that are going to take place. Congress doesn't get back until, I think it's November 12th. How important do you all think it is for there to be a major signal, at least on TPA, as the president is in Asia or before he's in Asia, to accomplish the objective that you're all talking about? And what realistically can we expect to happen other than the president's hug?
Great questions. What kind of signal needs to be sent, and what else needs to be done?
Ironically, the president has to send the signal, not Congress. The president has to say what he's going to demand will happen and has to happen in a lame duck session in terms of giving him the authority. He needs to have that clearly out there so that when he's in the room, his trading partners, his opposite numbers will take him seriously when he says deeply committed to it, and as Miriam was suggesting, is willing to roll up his sleeves at the end of the day. Because Congress is, as you know, going to be consumed with other things for the next couple of weeks. So there's no message there. But the president can help himself at the negotiating table drive this toward a conclusion by sending what his expectations, his own expectations are. The irony is, which I think it took a while, in fairness, Miriam, for the administration to learn, was that Congress really needs the president to lay out the playing field, particularly in an area like this. Just saying, here's the ball, go run with it, without identifying what the goalpost stands for and what the hash marks are, makes for a real mess on Capitol Hill. And so this is one of those instances where I think the president can help lay down not only the commitment to get this done, but also to say, here's what the playing field looks like from his perspective. It's a way of inviting strong support from his own party, from those folks who would be supportive, and it's a way of signaling to Republicans that he's serious about it. He's going to confront them with the choice of not being able to sit on the sidelines and simply mow Democrats for not doing enough on trade or not bringing 20 votes. He's going to confront them with a choice. He needs to send that signal as well.
I think I absolutely agree with Grant that strong presidential leadership is essential. But, we've heard many times of artificial deadlines to get the TPP done. We heard that it needed to be concluded by the end of 2013 last year. Now by the end of 2014, there's some pressure, as you said, to get it done at this APEC meeting, November 11th to 14th. But as ITIF has said many times, it's far more important that we get the TPP done right than we get it done. An agreement that does not absolutely preserve strong intellectual property standards, impose disciplines on state-owned enterprises is simply not worth bringing forward to the American public. And as I said earlier, I think if TPA is in place, it does empower our trade negotiators to secure the very best offers from our trade partners. And so we'd say, let's get TPA done and then secure the best deal possible in 2015 if that's what it takes.
Ambassador?
So obviously, there's no time to see TPA enacted before the president goes to Asia. It's impossible given the schedule, of course. But I think there is an opportunity, as my colleagues have said, for the president to come out very forcefully on trade issues in terms of what he wants to see accomplished in the next few weeks, if he's willing to go out on a limb. But certainly next year, if it turns out the lame duck session stays lame. But I think it's also an opportunity for Congress, even though they're not back. But Chairman Camp has an opportunity to lay out what he'd like to see happen, the Speaker, and also Chairman Wyden. On November 5th, the November 4th election will be over. We still may not know who controls the Senate because there's a possibility of some of the races being so close they may go to runoffs in December and January. But at least on the 5th, there'll be a better idea of what happened on the 4th. And so I think Democrats, too, coming out more forcefully in favor of these agreements and a TPA approach, if they don't like the one that's on the table, what are changes, constructive changes that they would propose. It's going to be a really busy period of time. There isn't a lot of it, but again, there is an opportunity here if people want to take advantage of it.
Excellent. Next question is up there, and then who else would like to ask a question following?
Good morning. To what extent is the Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act of 1988 relevant to the current situation in terms of things, lessons learned or things not to do?
I don't know if you're looking at me because I'm the oldest guy here, but what I'd say, of course, is that 88 is relevant, in part because you have to appreciate the history of it was that Bill Brock had tried to move in 1984, and we ended up really with a disaster of a trade bill that then got reworked, actually in the process of conference, to something that was at least acceptable from the point of view of our being able to move forward on trade. So 88 was working off that background. The history was that, Jeff Lang and others sat back and said, we're really going to have to invite in a broader range of interests, certainly a broader range of committees, and have a conversation in the circumstances we found ourselves in the 80s about how we're going to be competitive. And to me, what strikes me about the model and its relevance, that I think is directly relevant to what I'm saying in the longer term, is saying you're going to have to do that to use TPA as a way of building a consensus. You're going to have to involve those other members. This is going to have to be a process of outreach from Ways and Means and Finance, as it was then, to try and say, what else do we need? So that you recall that the legislation had specific things on telecom, specific things on IP, variety of different measures that were actually addressing economic challenges in the global marketplace and domestically, as well as saying, here's what our trade agenda is. And I actually think that is the model that we're going to have to pursue going forward.
Comments? Other comments? Next question. And then who would like to ask the following question? Any hands in the audience?
Hi.
Back there.
My name is Victoria Guida. I'm a reporter with Politico. I apologize if this has already somewhat been spoken to, but in terms of bringing Democrats on board, do you think that something like TAA will be enough as sort of political cover, or will something more significant maybe be needed, maybe a change to trade remedy law or something more significant? Thank you.
I do think TA, which is Trade Adjustment Assistance, is going to be an important part of reauthorization. And I think it's also important because there can be job dislocation as a result of a trade agreement. The U.S. is one of the countries that does provide assistance and retraining, and it's vital that we continue to do that. I think other countries would also benefit from looking to how we do this because it is such an important part of a trade agreement. Again, I think there are opportunities here, and it would be a pity to miss this chance.
Of course, TAA, the thing that strikes me after all these years is how many times can you keep anting into the game with the same chip? In one sense, TAA is always helpful because it provides a dollop on the outside and says that we're addressing dislocation. But if you look deeply at how TAA functions, it doesn't work. And so at some point, and I think thinking here much more about Democrats who are serious about wanting to make sure that workers and families can participate in the global economy, are right to demand something fundamentally different in terms of our approach to what is fundamentally an economic adjustment problem. And there aren't many economists, Rob, among them, who actually recognizes that this is an adjustment issue. And much of what we think about economics doesn't focus on that point. But that's a much longer discussion than you can have if you want to move a TPA bill that's going to meet the needs of the president going to Asia and trying to find a way to crack a deal, and thinking very hard about the fact that Abe's own political mandate is weakening. Right, so there's a crisis point here as between two trading partners that are central to TPP, and adding another dollop to TAA could help, I guess. But fundamentally, that program needs to be rethought, and I would expect that that would be a demand, not unreasonable one, from Democrats to see as a part of any future approach on trade policy.
To your specifics, I'd be very surprised if the final outcome had changes to trade remedy laws, and even if it were in there, that would be enough to secure the votes of the folks who were proposing those changes in the first place. That being said, and I alluded to this earlier, I think there will be things that might get added as the bill goes along that are unexpected. I mean, that's the way the legislative process is supposed to work. Both bodies are actually supposed to be allowed to work their will. And there might be some things that cause discomfort. In that way, it could be similar to the 88 Trade Act. I mean, the 88 Trade Act, remember at the time, Japan was and our economic competitiveness with Japan was all the rage. One lasting thing of the 88 Trade Act is the Treasury Department's semi-annual report on foreign exchange, which now brings the interesting question twice yearly of how Treasury is going to avoid naming anybody a currency manipulator. But the useful thing about this sort of uncertainty of what the end product will be is, I tend to think it would be a healthy thing for Congress to have a real debate about what do we want our economic relationship with China, our economic relationship with our allies, and the export of U.S. natural resources, the economic relationship of within North America. It'd be a healthy debate to have when you're playing with something that's real, that's actually that has a chance of getting enacted. Unlike some of the debates that have happened where the House has passed a bill regarding currency manipulation that died in the Senate, and the Senate's passed a bill that's died in the House. You might actually see some really interesting, responsible legislating because of this would be, something that'd be known that was really going to become law, and there might be things that would make a lot of free traders uncomfortable, and I tend to think that's okay, and that's sort of what the trade, U.S. trade policy could really use to get a significant bipartisan majority behind it, and to achieve, I think, some of these important agreements, not only for the economics but for the geopolitics. I mean, we haven't really talked much about the geopolitics today, but when you look at TPP and TTIP, the geopolitics are very important, and that's always been a part of U.S. trade policy, or at least these past 50 years, 70 years. And so I think some things will be added. I don't know what they are, but I think it'll be a useful debate to have. So.
Any other comments?
I think you're really asking about the political economy of trade. And so, if you look at the decade of the 2000s, the U.S. lost 6 million manufacturing jobs, or 1/3 of its manufacturing workforce, a rate of manufacturing job loss actually worse than the Great Depression. And so we've run the math on what's actually responsible for that job loss. And it turns out about 60% was either productivity improvements in U.S. factories that decreased the need for workers. Part of it was the U.S. and our manufacturing industries losing competitiveness in global marketplaces. We were turning out cars of poor quality from Detroit. But as much as 40% of it was a result of foreign predation, unfair foreign trade practices, such as China flooding the global market for photovoltaic cells with cheap products that were subsidized by their government, putting firms like Solyndra and American workers out of business. So I think when you see polling that says 68% of Americans support global trade agreements, they recognize that global trade maximizes global welfare. But that's only the case if we're putting in place the resources necessary to ensure that our trade partners play by the rules that they've signed on to in global trade agreements. And therefore, I think it's not only about offering trade adjustment assistance to help those workers who have been displaced by trade, but also we need to be investing significantly more in trade enforcement resources. We should increase by at least 20% the funding for the Interagency Trade Enforcement Center. And we also need to equip USTR with new resources like an Office of Globalization that will help them think through some of these globalization and trade issues. And one other point on TAA, to feed it back in SharePoint grants. I mean, TAA is a reactionary policy. TAA is saying, we lost jobs to global trade, now let's help these people out. A far better policy is proactive and invest more in workforce training and education to ensure that our workers for tomorrow have the skills they need to compete in the global economy. And I think that's a more sustainable solution to that issue.
I think one of the reasons why I supported TAA when I was in Congress, and I was toward the end of my term of service, probably the most active Republican on this issue on Ways and Means, is that I am in fact a reactionary. But apart from that, I think the point I would make here to cap what our panel has said is that TAA is an important ingredient in a balanced trade policy properly conceived. It also, at this point in the political equation, provides very few additional votes for any trade legislation. And this is a frustration that many of us had who were pushing for TAA, and I consider myself on TAA a Bill Roth Republican. I think TAA is important to get and to get right. But unfortunately, those who have been looking for something else from our trade policy have largely ignored the benefits that TAA does provide to workers. So it has lost its political cachet, and that's most unfortunate. Are there any additional closing questions? We have one here and one there, and we may have time for one more. We're going to start with this gentleman here, and then we're going to go with that lady there for whoever has the microphone on this side. Oh, okay. Sir, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So I'm somewhat new to the trade issue.
Do us a favor and identify yourself.
Hi, my name's Steve Emmert, and I'm somewhat new on the trade issue. I'm sort of more of a lawyer/lobbyist than I am a trade person. And I've had some meetings on the Hill on Trade Promotion Authority. There's a sort of a timing and optics problem here with Trade Promotion Authority. You've negotiated your deal and are now asking for guidance on what deal to negotiate. As a lawyer, I would never hire a lawyer to negotiate a deal that he's already concluded. I want him to negotiate the deal that I want. So now that you're done negotiating TPP, you're asking for Congress for guidance. And I've gotten a lot of kind of snarky comments back about that from staff on the Hill. Also, there's this transparency question. I've been to at least, I would estimate, 40 to 50 briefings this year on TPP and TTIP. I've not seen a draft of anything. No text, no documents. When I talk to somebody about TPA and they say, well, what do you know about the content of TPP? You know, my response is, oh, they assure us that it's good. The concept of transparency is somewhat at odds with the concept outside of trade circles. I've negotiated a lot of deals over time as a lawyer, and I certainly don't like the idea of having hundreds of people looking over my shoulder on the deal I'm negotiating. But I'm somewhat at a loss as to how to counter some of those criticisms when I'm talking to congressional staff, both about timing, asking guidance after you've concluded your negotiation, and about transparency. When nobody has a document, nobody has a piece of paper, every time you go to a briefing, there's a few verbal comments, then they all leave the room. I've got nothing to show, and I've got no evidence that we have a deal that's worth doing. I don't know how to respond on that. I actually turned down a request to chair a committee to push for Trade Promotion Authority because I don't have anything that I feel confident that I can put out there with members of Congress. I appreciate any help on that.
Comments?
I'd love to take the first crack. On the guidance question, no, look, that's a great question. It's why I made my comment about the cart coming before the horse. And that's why Republicans on the Ways and Means Committee, among other reasons I'm sure I wasn't in the room, sent a letter to the president and USTR saying, if you close TPP, if you close these negotiations before you have TPA, we will oppose it on principle. Yes, is TPP a mature negotiation at this point? It is, but there's not a closed deal, and there's a big difference between having a closed deal and not having a closed deal. And you know, when Congress does TPA, they could throw an unusual wrench into that negotiation, and it'll have to be accounted for. So I don't think, as long as it doesn't get closed, it's not closed. And TPA coming first should address, I think, the very good point that you raised. On the transparency piece, I was part of the Bush administration, so I'm opposed to transparency as a general. No, I'm kidding. Look, there is the Trade Act of 74 set out a system to try to grapple with the fact that you can't have in negotiations between sovereign governments, every time somebody makes an offer, it getting, blasted out. And, when members of Congress negotiate with each other, that's not what they do. The nature of a negotiation is you have to be able to experiment without, to see what works without it necessarily becoming your hard and fast public position. And there's an advisory system that where private sector and NGOs can get access to negotiating texts that are classified and see it and provide advice on those texts. This is probably something that will be in a new TPA addressed about what is the relationship of members of Congress and their access to texts, and whether there's broader access on the Hill. But it's hard to imagine a dynamic that went too far beyond what the existing one is without it essentially being a ruse to basically kill the possibility of ever actually being able to reach a negotiation. And there was actually a court decision, a D.C. Circuit decision in the past couple of years that said, look, trade negotiations, they may involve economic matters, but at the end of the day, you're talking about negotiations between sovereign governments, and that's been going on since we've been a sovereign nation. And yes, the executive branch is able to keep certain things confidential, and there's been fights between the president and Congress since the first president and the first Congress on this type of issue.
I'm tempted to offer you a very glib response, which is just get a subscription to Inside U.S. Trade or the World Trade Report, because near as I can tell, Jutta Hennig, has like a chip in the copying machine, on the second floor at USTR. But more to the point, having been a staffer on the Hill, I got to tell you, honestly, you're not working very hard if you're not getting this information. So it's easy for people to say, I'm not being informed if they're not doing anything to do it. All they got to do is walk down to the Hall of Russell building on the Senate side, and you'll find there's a bunch of CRS publications which actually lay this stuff out pretty clearly. So there's stuff that's accessible about the parameters of negotiation. Now, will you get the last offer that's been put on the table by Brunei about what it intends to do with its recent shift towards Sharia and what that implies for negotiations about labor? No. We may want to have a debate about whether we should know more about that, but you're not going to find that at the CRS. And that is something where I think you have to rely on the process that does exist for the conversation between the folks in the administration and folks on the Hill. I will tell you, when I was working on the Finance Committee, I was never happy with the consultation process. And when I was working in the administration, I was more than satisfied with the consultation process. But no, in all seriousness, I really do think that the breakdown is that, I'm going to be very blunt here, and it's not a happy thing to say because it's about myself and my former colleagues. The reality is oftentimes USTR, like the State Department always did, treats Congress like the enemy, or at least like a foreign territory. And I was always shocked as a foreign service officer that not more of my colleagues didn't use the same skill they use so ably in another capital to understand politics and couldn't apply that faculty to Congress, right? Because ultimately, it really is about building relationships. And for that process of transparency really to work, it has to be, I'm thinking about what Miriam did very ably for many years at the State Department in terms of an area of security and economics that is certainly as challenging as anything on the trade front. I think Miriam, maybe more so given the politics lots of times. And the reality is you could still build relationships with people on the Hill that allowed them to have confidence in what you were trying to achieve at the negotiating table. So in that sense, I think there has to be something on both sides. There has to be people on the Hill who are actively looking for the information, and you can help be a conduit for that, even if it means getting a subscription inside U.S. Trade. The other thing, though, I got to say is honestly, it takes an effort by the administration to treat the process differently than it has many times in my experience. To be much more open and not really to think of an inquiry from an individual staffer. To me, I got to say, when I was at USTR, that was an opportunity, right, to build that relationship, to have that conversation, because I wanted to communicate the challenges we were facing in Latin America at the time, right? And I think, honestly, that's the better attitude to have, to be honest. But so it's going to have to be work on both sides, but that's at a very practical level. I think the architecture that's there is a workable architecture as it is right now.
Then we had a question up here, and does anyone
Sorry.
want to? I'm sorry.
Can I jump in on that? Because I think Steve's raised a really interesting question. I mean, I'm disappointed that that's the reaction you got, but I'm delighted that you have asked us about it. First of all, on transparency, as you mentioned, I spent the earlier part of my career at the State Department. And I have to say, and at the White House as well, when I got to USTR, I was struck at just, in a very positive way, just how closely the administration and the Congress together develop trade policy. And that is whether or not there is TPA. So in an ideal world, we would have had TPA, would not have lapsed, or would have been renewed, within the last 7 years. The fact that you don't have TPA doesn't mean you just sit there and wait for it. I mean, that would be a tremendous disservice to the American public. So in terms of the substantive piece of TPA, which is Congress articulating its objectives, trust me, that is going on and has been going on for the last 7 years, and it will go on if there is no TPA. So I honestly don't think there'll be surprises when we do get TPA, as many of us hope, because of these close consultations. And as Tim mentioned, there's also a very active advisory committee process, which anyone in this room can apply to join. There are about 600 or 700 advisors who have gone through a relatively short security clearance process, and they comment, they see all the texts, and they comment, they offer their perspectives to USTR. And that's whether they're from the business world, the labor community, environmental organizations, consumer interest groups, academic institutions. So there is a very vibrant process underway to address what's at the crux of this, which is that it's very hard for U.S. or any trading partner to negotiate in public. Just like Steve, two lawyers are not going to negotiate a solution to a client matter in public. It's just, as I mentioned earlier, it does not provide any opportunity for parties to explore different positions or different solutions. my last point is in terms of the procedural piece of TPA, it provides what's known colloquially as fast track. So it's an expedited procedure to get to a vote. It is not a yes vote on a trade agreement. So once the administration signs the agreement, which I it's just definitely not going to happen in November, with or without TPA. But once the agreement is done, hopefully with TPA already in place, then it's presented to Congress, it's presented to the public, and there's 3 months or more for people to ask questions, understand what does this mean, and then for Congress to take an up or down vote. So TPA is not a guarantee that an agreement is going to pass. It still has to be, not just a good agreement, but a great agreement. Not a perfect one, as I mentioned, but a great agreement that's going to generate enough support. And let me just add, I think Tim said this, but any member of Congress at any time can see any text that they want to, that the administration has prepared. So, and staff have broad access as well. So if someone says they don't know what's going on or they haven't seen the text, then I would definitely push back and say, well, have you asked?
Excellent. We had a question here, and do we have a final question after that? Anyone? One back there, and so those will be the... That's right.
Thank you. I'm Denise Baltasconis. I just wanted to ask the panel, it seems that the most likely chance for TPA to be renewed is during the lame duck session of Congress, but if that is unable to happen and the Republicans gain control of the Senate and already have control of the House, to what degree do you think that they will be likely to renew TPA and promote trade, or do you think they will continue with the obstructionist policies with the goals of the Obama administration?
First of all, I got to disagree with you that what they've been doing was necessarily obstructionist at every turn. And I do agree with what Mitch McConnell said. Sometimes saying no is the best option when somebody's proposing a bad policy. If you're suggesting, like on tax reform right now, that what's come out of the administration would actually enable American companies to participate in the global economy, that I would strike you as something you probably should obstruct, to be honest with you. Now, having said that, the reality is I think the president's got to make the demand, Congress can act, and I think what they'll find is, particularly if the numbers look like where they're going, Phil's the expert here, so second guess me, but I actually think it strengthens John Boehner's hand. I think with more Republican members and a greater diversity in that membership, there is actually less power to a small group that has drawn John away from what otherwise would be the instinct of the caucus. And in some respects, I think he'll have an opportunity to go further in support of what Republicans have supported forever in terms of trying to move ahead and engage the United States in the economy. Set aside is a much trickier proposition, of course, because the Finance Committee is very different than it used to be, and its makeup is complicated. So moving a bill through there, even with the Republicans, still got to get, since this is ordinary legislation, you still got to get cloture, you still got to do all those sorts of things with it. That's a much tougher proposition politically. And so I think the hard work, which Miriam alluded to, is that early on, the White House congressional folks have to be having a conversation with Senator Reid, since politics on the Senate side is driven by the leadership these days rather than chairman. And so at that point, you got to say, I need this for my legacy. If you're thinking about 2016, if you're thinking about retaking the Senate somewhere down the road, you got to show some progress on some economic policy. This one is very hard for labor, but on the other hand, there's things within this bill that labor has previously supported as the conditions they would add to TPA. So there's some grounds there in which you could say, time limited with respect to these negotiations, that Democrats should accept that, try and rebuild a base that allows them to say they are business friendly at a certain level. That's the pitch I'd be making at this point.
One quick point, going back to your premise. I mean, the fact is the administration chose not to push for it in 2013. President did mention the State of the Union in 2014. Speaker said he was supportive. It was Senator Reid that said it's not going to happen in 2014, and the administration didn't push back on that. And then, as I said earlier, if you look at what Republican leaders, if they win, are saying they want to work on with the president, they're talking about trade. And when Democrats took over the Congress, to be honest, within the administration, there were plenty of folks who were telling us we were crazy by saying we thought we could work on trade with the Democrats, because there were a lot of new members who got elected who, the Iraq war back then was the real issue in the 2006 elections. But there were a lot of members who were of the Democratic majority then who were very opposed to trade. But we were looking at what the incoming chairman of the Ways, Means, and Finance Committees were actually saying. They were saying they wanted to work on trade. They wanted to try to make progress. They wanted to sort of move the pendulum back from what had started to veer in a bit of a partisan direction on trade bills, where it was almost too much one party being in favor of it and not enough the other. And we took them at their word, and part of the success was probably we thought we could do it, so we didn't have really people looking over our shoulder either. But I think there's a real opportunity there. You have to take leaders at their word about what they want to do and give it a shot. That's the only way you get a legacy. And hopefully it just won't be 2 years of just yelling at each other. So,
Ambassador, your thoughts?
So I just want to be clear. So I didn't say that it's most likely that we'll see TPA in the lame duck. What I said was this is a key opportunity because there's a narrow window, and if people miss this opportunity, it's going to be a lot harder to do it for some time. I think if the Democrats do lose the Senate and the Republicans control both houses, it's going to look easier. But I think whether it really is easier is going to depend on John Boehner's willingness to work with Democrats. And that's really key, because these are hard votes and hard decisions, and not really just for Democrats, but also for new Republicans, and especially, I would say, for Tea Party Republicans, whether they're new or old. So I think he's going to have to show an ability to reach across the aisle and really find common ground. I don't think it's that hard if you make the economic arguments and the strategic arguments that we just discussed a little bit briefly here, but they are there, and all of us have made them before. If you want to follow up and read what we've written, the last point I would stress is that it's really important to have this discussion and see anything pass in November, or if it doesn't happen now, hopefully next year. It's really important to get the facts out there. 3 words: trade costs jobs. Makes a great bumper sticker, but unfortunately it's not true. You've probably seen references to TPP being NAFTA on steroids. Well, in the 7 years after NAFTA, the U.S. actually created 7 million jobs. So if it was true, then that part of it would probably be a good thing. But what's critical is, as we discussed earlier, the jobs of yesterday are not the jobs of today, and they're not the jobs of tomorrow. So figuring out how we help our workforce adapt, training now, TAA when current opportunities aren't enough, or other mechanisms that we haven't yet thought of that can help make this easier is going to be critical. But getting the right information out there so people understand what they're voting on. And Steve doesn't hear more comments or questions like he got.
Thank you, and that's excellent. And I have to say, the good news is that we've seen in the House a willingness post-2010 to move forward on trade issues and to consider giving the administration, whatever the differences between House Republicans and the administration, trade promotion authority and support them on a broad trade agenda. And I think it's obviously going to be critical in both houses that we have a bipartisan buy-in and a willingness to support the administration by both parties to get these agreements moved forward, given their ambition, their scope, and ultimately their strategic significance. So I think those points are well taken. The last question is in the back, and you have the wrap-up.
Hi, Jen Riccardi from the Embassy of Luxembourg. I think I've heard a couple people on the panel say that there is a path to TPA in the lame duck, but my unfair question to the panel is, if you were forced to take a bet on whether that would happen, what kind of odds would you be offering?
Sorry, I didn't actually.
If you had to bet, what odds would you give on TPA during the lame duck?
It depends on whether you're giving me the money to play with. No, actually, I think the odds are low because I don't have the confidence that a lot of the political legwork has been done at this point. But there may be people closer to the process than I am that know more about it than I do. But I do think the telling argument in that, which can be raised and bring the argument to a head for the lame duck, is one about what we need in the way of economic stimulus. It really is the most important thing we should do right now in our economic context as well as in the global economic context to send the right sort of signal. So that, I think, whether it's our allies, whether it's here at home, whether it's among Democrats or Republicans, understanding what Miriam pointed out about this being really, a winner in terms of trying to put a positive bump into the economy is the most telling argument to bring the argument to a head. And I hope the president uses it.
I would say that the odds are probably slightly higher in the 114th Congress than in the lame duck session. But I did want to add one point pertinent to the previous question. If we pass TPP and TTIP, that will result in a decrease in customs revenues and tariff income for the United States. And I have heard in some Republican precincts that they may make a part of the negotiating objectives that there would have to be pay-fors for any reductions in income received by the government. And I just think that's a very poor idea. These agreements will expand economic growth in the long run. If we have to do dynamic scoring by the CBO, let's do so. But to insist on upfront offsetting dollars before we get these trade agreements done, I think would be unfortunate policy to pursue.
I'm not a betting man.
Ambassador, you have the last word.
Oh, don't tell my kids I had the last word. I would say, first of all, on the pay-for question, typically when an agreement is presented to Congress, the administration has to explain how the pay-for mechanism is going to work, and then ultimately Congress will have to agree to it. So I agree with Steve. It's premature to do that at this point. To answer your question, I would tell you that I need more data. I need to know how hard people are going to work to take advantage of this very narrow window that does exist.
I think that's well said. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank our team at Aaron Fox for facilitating, but I particularly want to thank Rob Atkinson and his group at ITIF for putting together an extraordinary program. Rob puckishly talked me into co-chairing his board, and I have to say it's been a lot of fun. And I also want to say I appreciate what ITIF is contributing to the policy arena. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. You did a fabulous job. I should have traded your seats.